Voilà. Hartelijk welkom iedereen die inlogde voor deze webinar over investeringen in illegale Israëlische nederzettingen. And a special word of welcome for our guest speakers, Ines, Abdel, Razek en Jozef Vandermeulen. Ik ga dus nu Nederlands spreken en Jozef zal straks in het Engels, denk ik, iets vertellen. Nee, je gaat ook in het Nederlands doen, hè?
Ja, ik ga ook in het Nederlands praten.
Ja. En Ines gaat dan in het Engels spreken. Dus Pax Christi Vlaanderen is eigenlijk al sinds haar oprichting in 1973 nauw betrokken bij de situatie van geweld en onrecht in Palestina en Israël. En samen met partners hier in België, maar ook ter plaatse in Israël en Palestina en binnen het internationale Pax Christi-netwerk brengen wij het onrecht dat in dit gebied plaats heeft onder de aandacht van zowel de gewone burgers als beleidsmakers en zoeken wij naar manieren om op een duurzame en dus geweldloze manier tot een oplossing te komen. Een van de pistes die wij bewandelen is het sensibiliseren van mensen in de eigen samenleving. We doen dit onder andere dankzij getuigenissen, maar ook rapporten en analyses die de vaak erg rauwe realiteit op het terrein onder de aandacht brengen. Velen onder ons hebben de realiteit ook al met eigen ogen gezien en willen iets doen om het onrecht te stoppen. Daarom zetten we ook acties op, gericht naar beleid en versterken we dit beleidswerk samen met 1111 en Pax Christi International, onze belangrijkste koepels op dat vlak. Het tonen van onze solidariteit is ook een manier om actie te ondernemen. Dat doen we bijvoorbeeld sinds 2018 met de jaarlijkse Nakba-herdenking op 15 mei. Komend weekend zullen er opnieuw in verschillende steden en gemeenten stiltecirkels georganiseerd worden om de aanhoudende onderdrukking van de Palestijnen aan te klagen. De Nakba van 1948 is immers nog niet voorbij. Daarom spreken we in het Engels van ongoing Nakba of in het Nederlands de voortdurende Nakba. Nakba is Arabisch voor catastrofe en is hetgeen wat de Palestijnse inwoners van het gebied dat we vandaag Israël-Palestina noemen, is overkomen in 1948 bij de oprichting van de staat Israël. Toen joegen Joodse milities 750.000 Palestijnen uit hun huizen. En dit herdenken we dus komende zaterdag en zondag. En aan het eind van de webinar zal ik jullie nog informatie geven daarover. Jaarlijks zoomen we bij de herdenking van de Nakba in op één aspect. En dit jaar maken we dankbaar gebruik van het werk van de coalitie Don't Buy into Occupation. Dankzij grondig onderzoek werden honderden bedrijven en financiële instellingen die via leningen of andere financiële producten betrokken zijn bij Israëlische nederzettingenindustrie in kaart gebracht. De financiering van illegale praktijken van de Israëlische overheid moet stoppen en daarom zullen we straks luisteren naar de sprekers die ons meenemen in dit verhaal. Via het Midden-Oosten-platform van 1111 was ook Pax Christi Vlaanderen betrokken bij de bekendmaking van het rapport dat de coalitie opstelde en namen we deel aan 2 acties, 1 aan het kantoor van BNP Paribas en 1 aan het kantoor van het ministerie van Financiën. Tevens riepen we mee op om brieven te sturen naar 5 Belgische banken die steun verlenen aan bedrijven die in illegale nederzettingen investeren of werkzaam zijn. We zijn blij dat Jozef Vandermeulen van Fairfin en Ines, Abdel, Razek van de Palestine Institute for Public Democracy ingegaan zijn op onze uitnodiging om daar nu toelichting bij te geven. Jozef, ik geef jou graag als eerste het woord.
Ja, dankjewel. Werkt mijn camera voor jullie, want die is bij mij plots uitgevallen. Wacht, je bent gemute. Oh my.
We zien jou inderdaad niet.
Ja, graag. Ik zal het proberen oplossen, maar...
Ah ja, ik kan wel eventjes zeggen misschien dat inderdaad, dat ben ik vergeten, als mensen iets willen meedelen aan de groep of iets technisch, dan kan je de chat gebruiken. Als je tijdens het horen van de uiteenzetting vragen hebt voor de panelleden, dan kan je de Q&A gebruiken.
Oké, ik zal er misschien heel even in en uit springen om te zien of mijn camera dan terug werkt. Als het dan niet werkt, dan zal ik gewoon zonder camera mijn uitleggen.
Oei, ja.
Is dat oké? Ja.
Oké. Dan wachten we even tot Jozef terug is aangelogd.
Ja, lijkt niet te werken.
Nee, jammer. Daarnet
Dus-
deed hij het nog.
Ja, graag.
Ja.
Voilà. Hij is aangesprongen. Oké, super. Goed. Ja, zoals Anne-Marie al zei, ik ben Jozef, ik werk bij Fairfin. Fairfin is een VZW die onderzoek voert en campagnes opzet, vooral gefocust en enkel gefocust op het financieel systeem. Omdat wij geld willen inzetten als hefboom voor een wereld die sociaal en ecologisch duurzaam is. Ik ben inhoudelijk medewerker bij Fairfin, dus ik voer mee aan onderzoek en dan help ik achteraf ook mee om die campagnes op te zetten en daar dingen mee te bereiken, veranderingen mee te bereiken. Wij focussen ons bij Fairfin op de financiële sector, omdat die enorm veel geld controleert. En via al dat geld enorm veel invloed heeft. Want uiteindelijk is het de financiële sector die in grote mate beslist welke bedrijven en welke activiteiten geld krijgen en welke niet. Dus daardoor beslissen zij ook deels welke dingen kunnen gebeuren en welke dingen niet kunnen gebeuren. Want een activiteit of een idee of een project dat geld kan ophalen, dat zal kunnen gebeuren. En een project dat geen geld kan binnenhalen, ja, dat zal niet kunnen gebeuren. Dus bij Fairfin zeggen we vaak dat het geld van vandaag de wereld van morgen bepaalt. Als we vandaag investeren in fossiele brandstoffen, dan zullen we fossiel blijven gebruiken. Als we vandaag investeren in bedrijven die de mensenrechten schenden, zullen zij blijven de mensenrechten schenden. En dus daarom focussen wij ons op de financiële sector. Want geldstromen verplaatsen of stopzetten is volgens ons een enorm sterke hefboom om de wereld duurzamer en rechtvaardiger te maken. En dus als onderdeel van die missie zijn we deel van de Don't Buy Into Occupation coalitie. Dat is een coalitie van 27 Europese en regionale organisaties die de connecties wil blootleggen tussen de Europese financiële sector en bedrijven die actief zijn in de illegale Israëlische nederzettingen in bezet Palestijns gebied. En we hebben dus gekeken naar quasi alle Europese financiële instellingen. En daar zijn 700 banken en investeerders uitgekomen uit Europa die bedrijven financieren waarvan bewezen is dat die actief zijn in de nederzettingen. En ik zal aan Ines misschien de kans laten om dat meer in detail uit te leggen en uit te leggen waarom dat belangrijk is en welke invloed dat heeft. Maar het belangrijkste om te weten is dat we miljarden en miljarden, honderden miljarden euro's aan steun vonden die vanuit Europese financiële instellingen ging naar bedrijven die in die nederzettingen actief zijn. En wat Fairfin doet bij de Don't Buy Into Occupation coalitie is mee het analyseren en verwerken van die data. Maar een groot deel van wat we doen is ook het contact met banken aangaan. En proberen gesprekken met banken opstarten, onze conclusies en ons onderzoek aan hen voorstellen. En dan met suggesties of met eisen komen over wat ze kunnen doen om de situatie te verbeteren. En onze eis op dit moment aan de banken is nog vrij licht, vind ik zelf. En dat is om gesprekken op te starten met de bedrijven in kwestie, om meer informatie van hen te vragen. En als die bedrijven dan niet genoeg informatie of uitleg of rechtvaardiging kunnen geven voor hun aanwezigheid in de nederzettingen, dan vinden wij dat de banken zo snel mogelijk hun geld moeten wegtrekken uit die bedrijven. Maar we vinden ook dat banken voorwaarden moeten opnemen in het beleid om in de toekomst geen bedrijven meer te financieren die actief zijn in de nederzettingen. En dat ze dus bijvoorbeeld actief zijn in de nederzettingen opnemen als voorwaarde in hun investeringsbeleid. Dat ervoor zou zorgen dat een bedrijf geen extra financiering meer kan krijgen. Dus dat zijn eisen die we stellen aan de bank in gesprekken met hen. Maar om die gesprekken gewoon al te kunnen starten en om de nederzettingen op de agenda te kunnen stellen en om die eisen te kunnen stellen tegenover hen, is het ook enorm belangrijk dat er externe druk staat op die banken. Want als we het gewoon vriendelijk aan hen gaan vragen, dan zullen zij niks veranderen, want het blijft winstgevend om die bedrijven dan te financieren. Dus daarom dat die externe druk zo belangrijk is. En dus organiseren wij fysieke acties, zoals Anne-Marie ook al zei, aan het kantoor van BNP Paribas, of bij de minister van Financiën, of nu in de komende weken, zoals Pax Christi doet rond de landbouw. En we roepen daarnaast op om klachtenbrieven te sturen, massaal klachtenbrieven te sturen naar de banken. En het zijn dat soort acties die onze stok achter de deur zijn bij de financiële instellingen, om zo gesprekken te kunnen opstarten. Die spelen dus een heel belangrijke rol in onze aanpak en onze strategie. We hebben vooral hard ingezet op BNP Paribas bij die klachtenbriefcampagne, omdat zij de grootste investeerder zijn die uit ons dossier naar voren kwam. En ook omdat zij in België heel groot zijn en omdat de Belgische overheid de grootste aandeelhouder is van BNP Paribas. Dat is een gevolg van de redding tijdens de financiële crisis van Fortis. Maar dus we hebben vooral gefocust op BNP en we hebben zo bijna 2000 klachtenbrieven naar een bestuur kunnen sturen. En dus heel hard geprobeerd om een reactie van hen te krijgen daarop. We hebben eerst heel lang gewoon alle reactie geweigerd. Gewoon gezegd, geen commentaar, no comments. We houden ons hier volledig buiten. Maar sindsdien hebben we toch al een gesprekje kunnen opstarten. We hebben binnenkort nog een gesprek waar het thema op de agenda staat. Dus we zien wel langzaamaan een beetje beweging komen. Daarnaast hebben we ook de focus gelegd op Belfius. Omdat Belfius voor 100% in handen is van de Belgische overheid. Wij vinden dus dat Belfius als publieke bank potentieel heeft om een voorbeeldrol te spelen in dit dossier. En eigenlijk te tonen aan de rest van de bankensector hoe dat echt sterk beleid eruit ziet. En dat is op dit moment absoluut nog niet het geval. En Belfius heeft via haar beleggingsmanager meerdere investeringen in bedrijven die actief zijn in nederzettingen. Maar wat we wel hebben gemerkt, is dat ons verhaal en onze acties en onze klachtenbrieven raken de banken duidelijk. Want we krijgen heel heftige en heel felle reacties. Want we doen bij Fairfin natuurlijk we zijn al decennia lang bezig rond de banken, dus we hebben heel veel ervaring met dat soort gesprekken en proberen opstarten. We hebben nu gemerkt dat we echt wel uitzonderlijk heftige reacties krijgen, dat ze ons dossier echt heel hard in vraag stellen of proberen ondermijnen of proberen tegenspreken. De grootste kritiek die ze geven is dat wij kijken naar al het geld dat zij geven aan een bedrijf. En dat we niet dat allemaal aan hen kunnen toeschrijven, omdat maar een deeltje van dat geld naar de nederzettingen zal gaan. Maar het ding is, wij kunnen niet weten hoeveel van dat geld effectief naar de nederzetting gaat en hoeveel naar andere activiteiten van het bedrijf. En de bank weet dat ook niet. De bank geeft gewoon een pot geld aan een bedrijf en zegt van hier, doe er maar iets mee. En wij vinden dat als je als bank een bedrijf zomaar een pot geld geeft, dan ben je mede verantwoordelijk voor alles dat ze met die pot geld doen. En dan ben je ook verantwoordelijk om te weten waar dat geld naartoe gaat en waar niet. En je bent als bank perfect in staat om een lening te geven aan een bedrijf en te zeggen van kijk, hier is wat geld, op voorwaarde dat je het niet gebruikt in een nederzetting. Maar dat doen ze niet. Dus dat is onze reactie op die kritiek. En de tweede kritiek die ze vaak geven, of het antwoord, de reactie die ze vaak geven, is dat ze al een mensenrechtenbeleid hebben en dat de investeringen die ze doen al afgecheckt zijn en dat ze al een human rights policy hebben of een code of conduct die ze volgen. Maar voor ons is het duidelijk dat als je een mensenrechtenbeleid hebt en dat toepast, maar je investeert nog steeds in de Israëlische nederzettingen, ja, dan schiet je mensenrechtenbeleid gewoon tekort. En dan is het gewoon niet streng genoeg of niet duidelijk genoeg, of dan wordt het niet strikt genoeg toegepast, of dan is het niet uitgebreid genoeg. Maar dan schiet er duidelijk iets tekort. Want een echt goed mensenrechtenbeleid, dat met een hele keten rekening houdt, ja, dat zou dat soort investeringen niet toelaten. Dus dat vinden wij ook, eerlijk gezegd, een heel zwak argument. Maar het is eigenlijk het feit dat banken zo heftig reageren en zo hard tegen ons proberen ingaan op het dossier, is eigenlijk een heel goed teken. Want dat toont aan dat ze oncomfortabel zijn hierop, dat ze aanvoelen dat er iets niet helemaal juist zit en dat ze dus heel hard aan terugreageren zijn, dat dit gevoelig ligt. En dat betekent dus ook dat we impact kunnen hebben als we blijven druk zetten. Dus daarom dat we ook met de coalitie brengen we elk jaar een rapport uit, we gaan elk jaar blijven acties voeren. Daarom dat het ook belangrijk is om te blijven klachtenbrieven te sturen, om te blijven fysieke acties doen, zodat we kunnen gebruik maken van die openingen die we langzaam aan het creëren zijn, om zo proberen op termijn het geld uit de Israëlische nederzettingen weg te halen. Dus dat is eigenlijk de basisstrategie die Fairfin en die hele coalitie volgt om te proberen verandering te creëren. Ik zal nu misschien Ines laten uitleggen wat het rapport exact inhield en wat het belang van dit onderzoek is voor Palestijnse organisaties. Ines, I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Yeah, so I think the work that has been done with this coalition, both from a research and then a campaigning perspective, the overall approach is to understand that we're in a situation right now in Palestine with the occupation and also apartheid in general, where the only way forward and the path forward is the end of impunity, and I think holding Israel accountable. and holding anyone who's complicit in war crimes and, in these decades-long violations of international law and human rights accountable. And so this is where both private actors and also governments can act. And very clearly, the settlement enterprise, and so the colonization, mainly of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, participates to consolidating, I think, Israel's regime, Israel's discrimination. And this is where I think there is momentum, and also there is, I think, international, I think, realization in some ways that private actors can do better, whether it's for environmental rights or social rights, labor rights, human rights, and Palestine is one of them. And I think we should really be more, put forward that we're asking companies, if they can divest from Russia, they can divest certainly from Palestinian occupied territory and Israeli illegal settlements. So the report looks, as you know, only at mainly West Bank and occupied territories, and the idea was to look at the financial flaws, like as you might know, the UN but also even the BDS campaign, have looked at the companies that are involved in the settlements. And the idea behind the Don't Buy Into Occupation and the DBIO coalition was to look at, okay, who are actually the financiers and the shareholders, the investors, the creditors behind these companies that are proved to be directly involved. So the campaign has looked at 50 companies. There are more, but there are known 50 companies that are actively involved in the colonization, in the settlement enterprise in the West Bank. And what that means is very concrete things. It means, first and foremost, is sales of weapons and arms to the Israeli forces, like Elbit System is one of the companies where you have European financial institutions involved in Elbit System. And the states, the army, the Israeli forces are actively involved in facilitating, protecting the building of settlements, which leads to Palestinian expropriations, demolition of houses. So the demolition of houses also has, companies involved like Volvo, Caterpillar with the bulldozers, the illegal construction of the settlements. So construction companies and also Israeli banks that European banks are involved in, have been identified as directly involved. It also means, to maintain this control and the taking over of land and the stealing of land, of Palestinian land. It means keeping the control of Palestinians, keeping the security, the control, and the segregation of Palestinians. So that means mass surveillance. So we have Motorola, for example, as a company that has been identified, and where European, again, financial institutions are involved, and it goes down to samen companies like the German company Heidelberg that has a quarry in Palestinian territory, or Airbnb that continues to rent Israeli settlement houses in stolen land. So there is a very large range of companies that ultimately all contribute to making Palestinian lives miserable, difficult, and basically you have Palestinians living under repression every day, and these companies and the European financial institutions financing them are complicit. So I think it's very important to understand that chain, that we're asking the Europeans to stop their complicity, because by continuing to fuel these companies with investments, by basically we have to follow the money, and where the money is, it's contributing to maintain further annexation of the West Bank and Jerusalem. And obviously the latest example is Masafariata. So 2 examples in the news, and again, we're entering the week of the remembrance of the Nakba, and for Palestinians, Nakba has been ongoing. It's not over. So there was a massive ethnic cleansing in 1948, another massive one in 1967. But if you look at the constant annexation and facilitation of the settlement enterprise, it has expropriated and forcibly displaced a lot of Palestinian communities. And I think it's very important to show that Masafariata today, when the Supreme Court of Israel is deciding that it's okay to forcibly, erase 12 villages, or 8 villages, actually, the court said, but as part of the 12 villages of Masafariata that are under threat of demolition, they're giving the green light to war crimes. And there are several settlements there that have been encroaching slowly on these villages. Settler violence that has been, prompted and probed and helped also by the lack of accountability and the lack of consequences for this settler violence. So I think that's the concrete impacts that you can show. And obviously, in Masafariata particularly, the water situation is terrible, and in other parts of the West Bank too, like the Jordan Valley. You have the settlement enterprise, especially agro businesses, for example, that are clearly making these lands more dry and creating droughts. And Palestinians cannot build a well if a well or Palestinians are trying to access the water. The infrastructure is often demolished or often demolished. So I think it's basically dirty business, and I think we have to take to their world some of the companies like BNP Paribas and others like Booking.com that praise themselves of having human rights policies and to respect to have like sustainability into their core values, but actually are facilitating these war crimes and ultimately make Palestinian lives miserable and contributing to the dispossession. So I think that's the important things we have been trying to underline in the campaigns, and very concretely now in terms of campaigning, there are I think Jozef talked a bit about it, but like next week there is the annual General Assembly of BNP. So we're really trying that more and more people send letters to BNP executive, but also we want to put pressure on the shareholders. The Belgian government is one of the major shareholders of BNP Paribas, as well as the Luxembourg government, and also a American investor called BlackRock. And so, calling them out, naming, shaming is important. For them to realize that this is not okay. And also our colleagues at BankTrack are going to ask a question hopefully within the annual assembly, as they have a seat as a small shareholder, so they have like they have the right to ask a question. And the other important campaign outside the BIO that I think is very much related is as much as we can boycott a lot of these companies, as much as we want to not buy Israeli products or try to boycott this or that company that is involved in settlements, sometimes they're just there. And so the question is, how can we actually start by making sure the EU is not complicit and stop exports and imports from products and production from the illegal Israeli settlements, and doesn't sell also European products there. That is also another bit, because it has to ultimately go down to also public authorities, and the EU has the competency to do that. So obviously it's not enough, because to hold Israel accountable, we need to eventually boycott most of Israeli products. But eventually, if you look at actually these companies, most of the Israeli companies, most of the Israeli production that comes from illegal settlements comes from companies that don't differentiate, because Israel today, and that's an important point, Israel doesn't differentiate between occupied territory or non-occupied territory. Israel, there's no green line for Israel. There is just one territory that they control. Settlers can come and go freely. They have all the rights, while Palestinians are fragmented, segregated, and living under this massive repression. And it's important to understand that if we start by stopping, settlement production, we will also stop many Israeli companies overall, because they don't differentiate at all. So the important is to also, I mean, the way this campaign works is directly asking the Commission through a petition that has gone through a lot of legal process to be accepted by the EU Commission, to that is asking to pass a legislation to basically just adjust and align EU trade policy with international law. So all it's asking is basically, EU, do your job. EU, just align yourself to your own standards and stop trade in occupied territories, in all occupied territories in the world. And what we need to do is gather 1 million signatures, which is not that easy. So basically, every mobilization there counts to get really a lot of signatures from across different countries. I think Netherlands is important, Belgium is important. It's ongoing, and I think each I think network and bubble of different activism that is mobilized counts. I think I'll stop there, and then we can have a discussion.
Thank you, Ines. Yes, Jozef, thank you also for sending the message into the chat, but I think you only send it to me and the panelists. I've just sent it also to everyone, but I don't know if you have access to the chat, everyone.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Now it's up to the people who are listening to ask questions. You can do that by putting the questions in the chat or in the Q&A. But I myself already have a question. Ines, I was wondering if there were already initiatives before to make the financial world more transparent, or is this the first initiative you know of?
In relation to Palestine?
Yes,
specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there has been, in the past, there was a very good report on French banks, if I'm not mistaken, that had been done by, I think, some of the solidarity groups there that had done a good research into the complicity of banks and their links to the occupied territory. So I think the research into the financial ties was already there. I think there are also
There's
other
also Belgian reports.
Yeah. Okay.
That's right.
I think the generally the Business and Human Rights Resource Center has also been working quite a bit on documenting. So the Business and Human Rights Resource Center is a resource center that you can search a lot of companies, a lot of investors, and they research around the world about the basically any kind of business wrongdoing with human rights. And they have done also quite a bit of following up and information on Palestine related violations. Yeah, also I had not sent to everyone. There's also oh wait. There's also a initiative called American Initiative that is also looking at Palestine, called Heartland Initiative. that has been looking at financial ties with, I mean, particularly shareholders, trying to convince shareholders and investors, but their work is more advocacy behind the scenes with shareholders and investors. And I think that's an important part too, right? I think for us, the idea is to do public facing activism, but also the back end, I think, advocacy that we don't do, for example, but I know in the Don't Buy Into Occupation coalition, there are groups that are more used to do that. I think it's important to go and look at the power dynamics. And so, for example, now our colleagues have been approaching the Ministry of Finance of Belgium, because on the one hand, you have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Belgium that is looking at differentiation and respecting human rights and looking at children detention. And while the Ministry of Finance is funding a bank that's clearly involved heavily with billions in companies involved in settlements. So it's also, we need to be able to engage with some of these actors directly. So I think there has been initiatives around that.
Yeah, if I can add a little bit, there's, I think 2 or 3 years ago, Elvelvelf and Fairfin and also Financité and CNCD, I think, did a report on the links between Belgian banks and Israeli banks. So interbank relationships, also focusing on the occupation. But that was only between Belgian banks and Israeli banks. And now we're looking at European banks and financial institutions and all sorts of companies, including banks, but also other things. So in a way, this Don't Buy Into Occupation coalition for us is sort of an expansion of a smaller report we already did a few years ago.
Thank you. There is a question in Dutch, I will translate it. If products coming from settlements have to be labeled, wouldn't it be logic that these companies should report about their activities? So I don't know if there is an obligation towards companies to report. Does any one of you have
unfortunately, the technical arrangement between the EU and Israel on this is that it falls still on Israel to actually label, which means they don't do it. Obviously, they actually contour, like they produce some products in the occupied territories, then label it as made in Israel, and then sell it in the EU. So there are ways technically to change that. It's about to change the technical arrangement and make the EU, basically doing their part and doing their job in the customs department to better control that. So that's another layer of complication, obviously, is that right now most of the products come as made in Israel, regardless. And we know the labeling is not enough. I mean, again, even if you're labeling correctly, you're putting on the ultimate consumer to violate or not human rights. That's very absurd and definitely not enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to realize also that what we're looking at here is obviously not always something you find in your supermarket. I mean, we're talking industrial products, machinery, chemicals. I mean, things that eventually is out there in your industries, in European industries, or European industries involved in settlements themselves. But it's not something that you can boycott yourself directly.
Yes, I see. Then there is a second question. The Belgian government says that it will take measures together with the other EU member states to call Israel to its duties. Is it already visible, or is there already some impact in your country or region?
unfortunately not. I think the Belgian government is well intended, but so far, and like, unfortunately, as we know with European governments, it's been a lot of words and a lot of some political commitments that we have to recognize from the Belgian side, but you know, they are definitely not following through as of now. I think, you know, this is where it's very important to push the government to you know, making sure they use the leverage, for example, with being one of the largest shareholders in the, or single shareholders of BNP Paribas, to you know, make sure BNP Paribas divests from the companies or makes the right human rights due diligence to make sure that they withdraw any activity in the illegal settlement industry, as well as obviously better impose. I mean, the labeling is one thing, but they need to also strengthen the customs to make sure that even those that are already, you know, better labeled can be controlled in the customs. And accountability means a lot of things. I mean, there's many other measures that can be taken. You know, there is a lot of cooperation, bilateral cooperation between European countries and Israel that are not taking into account, that are eventually, you know, benefiting the settlement enterprise and the colonization of the West Bank and annexation. So no, it's definitely, we're not there yet, unfortunately.
Then I have a question for Jozef. Which banks are good or sustainable or fair?
Well, we so apart from we have the bank Razek, which I post in chat, which is sort of a scoring of the investment policy of various banks active in Belgium. And we also look, one of the conditions we look at is excluding settlements. So we see there that, for example, Newbie or Triodos have decided to exclude any companies active in settlements. So those are two very good options. But I think generally the easy rule of thumb is the smaller a bank, the better it is generally. Because these big multinational corporations, for them really profit is the one go-to. And they're also much harder to control, and they're involved in way more companies, involved in way more international companies. While looking at small banks, they will often, so small Belgian banks will mostly invest in Belgian companies, small Belgian companies, and they will be more easily held accountable. They will listen more to feedback we give them, advice we give them. So on Bankwijzer, you can already look at some scores. There's also scores per theme, and human rights is one of the themes. So you can take a look there for some advice. But generally, a small bank is better than a big bank. And like, for example, BNP Paribas is one of the biggest banks in the world. It's, I think, number 7 or number 8. So they're generally good to avoid if you want to make sure your money is going to companies that don't violate human rights or are not active in Israel.
Yeah. I think that also Fairfin cannot make promotion for any bank, but in the beginning, Frederik wrote that he changed from BNP Paribas to Triodos and VDK, and I can add myself that I changed, well, when I found out that KBC was investing in nuclear weapon industry, I also switched to VDK.
Yeah, VDK also a good example of a smaller bank that focuses on sort of local investments.
I have a question. It's in English now. Somebody, I don't know. Can you cannot read the Q&As? Huh?
Yes.
It's best that I read them for you, right? So the question is, how can it be prevented that Israeli companies send goods through to settlements? And how far is it feasible for our banks to impose an obligation on Israeli companies not to send through to settlements?
I think I can take a small part of an answer, and maybe Ines can add. But generally, if a bank if a company takes out a loan with the bank, they'll sign a contract. And And so technically for a bank, it's quite easy to just put a small clause, so a small demand in the contract saying we don't want our money to be used for activities and settlements. That already happens for some other things. That's a normal part of contracts with banks. So that on a purely sort of technical and legal part, it's quite easy, especially considering a lot of the companies we're looking at are so multinational corporations, international corporations, and for their activities in Israel, they'll often have like an Israeli branch or like a specific sub company in Israel, and so it's easy to just exclude that branch. But I think maybe for the actual checking up on that and how do you know if a company is active in settlements or not, Ines can have more answer. But I also think, and that's more of a personal standpoint maybe of the coalition, I think the best way is just to exclude all Israeli companies, I think, because as Ines said, they don't make the differentiation, so they won't be able to, they won't follow that rule. But that's a personal opinion and not maybe an opinion of the coalition.
Yes, it is eventually very difficult. In any case, directly trying to hold Israeli authorities accountable and telling them, oh, do better, is an illusion, because there is the fact that the Israeli government, the Israeli institutions, the Israeli private sector lives and profits out of also 500, more than 600,000, 650,000 settlers that live in East Jerusalem and the West Bank combined. So supermarkets, banks, they all have branches and you know, they sell products there, etc. And Israel's government has no intention of dividing up, to make up that divide, because eventually for them it's they don't make the difference, and it's one territory, and that's in their interest to continue and invest in actually the settlements. Now, what's also difficult is indeed that once as a European organization or country, you say, okay, I will only invest in this branch. How do you control that the financial flows of money only on this side of the green line has not been used in one way or another to sell to a company that then is involved in the colonial enterprise in the occupied territory? It's very difficult. So I think especially when it comes to financial flows, it's very difficult to monitor. I think it is somehow possible, but I think it's up to the European banks and the European companies to be able to put in place such a heavy mechanisms of monitoring and control that it might cost them more, you know, for them more as a system than actually divesting in a way, because the level of monitoring that you need to do and control, I think, would require significant investment in that, which might be necessary in any case for any human rights violation in the world. I think they need to do better in terms of actually checking where their money is going. And that's where Jozef knows more how that's done. But I think when it comes to the legal system in Israel, it's very unlikely, you know, that you can tell an Israeli company, please don't sell the machinery or please don't sell any goods there. That won't happen.
Yes, that's very complicated. Okay, I have a next question. So our Secretary of State Kittir is visiting Palestine at this moment. Is that a step in the good direction, and does it help if people with these functions travel to Palestine? Do people often come from EU member states? That's the question.
They do. And she will meet with some organization partners in the coalition and civil society, I think it's always useful that they come. The question is the follow-up, and the question is the political will back home. I think what is important is that whoever holds the money in the budget, the public budget, and the decision making on, you know, the direction to take in the policy is the people you need to bring, and for them to see the reality. And I think it's a good thing when they come. Obviously, they can also come with Israeli lobbies like Elnet or AIPAC, or, you know, Elnet in Europe is very powerful, including in Belgium now, I think, or the American Jewish Congress. These lobbies, they make a tour that makes you completely erase the presence of Palestinians. So it can also be bad when they come, depending on who they come with. But let's say when they come as an independent delegation or as an official delegation, generally, I think they see parts of the reality. I think they realize. And I would say depends of the level also. So when a minister comes, it's such a high level that you will have so little time in the field, so little time in speaking to actual people, that it can be a bit overwhelming and maybe limited. However, I still think it's important. Now, the question is back home. Obviously, a secretary of state or a minister doesn't decide alone. It's part of a government, it's part of a coalition, and, you know, that's the difficult part in changing. I think there is the political will. I think it's a good sign she's coming. Parliamentarians have been coming too. I think that's also important. So raising awareness with politicians is important, and showing them the human side of the story, and showing them how, again, why is it important for Belgium? It's not, I think what's important is, you know, to also show it's not only this remote, this far away thing that's the Middle East, it's Palestine, it's not our issue. Well, you're actually complicit in what's happening. So how do you end, at least how do you do no harm? You know, how do you make sure that your policy, your involvement, your investments, your money, your political engagement is not helping Israel to continue apartheid and to continue the occupation? And I think that's what's important, is that as Belgian citizens, you want your government not to be involved in war crimes and crimes against humanity all over the world.
Yes, thank you. Then I have two more questions. What is the state of affairs concerning these issues in the United States? Is there something we can learn from them?
I think maybe quickly on the financial aspects. In general, we found that, we've seen that European financial institutions are easier to convince to disinvest. There's already a few good examples. There's a Norwegian pension fund, KLP, that have sort of written to a whole series of companies that are active in settlements, and then have eventually excluded a part of them. And we generally see the tendency that it's easier to talk to and try to convince European financial institutions than it is to convince American institutions. But I don't know, maybe more generally, I don't know if it's the same thing for companies or not. But for financial institutions in Europe, we're far from anywhere good, but it seems to be easier to move things.
Mm-hmm. Ines, do you have any experience?
But the US?
Yeah.
Yes. I think what was important in the US was to create very much, again, ties among different struggles. And I think this is still, I think, what's work in progress in Europe. I think when you're trying to hold your own government and politicians accountable to do better, they need to do better all across the world. And Palestine is one of them. I think sometimes, you know, the environmental rights or the social rights, or banning arms sales to Saudi Arabia because of Yemen and so on, is important. And it helps also putting that debate on the table because of the arms trade with Israel. So kind of trying to hold Israel accountable to the same standards as any other states, and making sure that the different people who organize, who are in solidarity with certain people, that have the same values and that are actually striving for the same human rights, you are with them. So one example is, you know, Israel's diplomacy and Israel's exports is really based now on selling these security apparatus all around the world. So digital surveillance technology, facial recognition, arms, weapons, walls, securitized walls, you know, all of this is exported. And I think you have to look at your own country. Where is actually Israeli technologies? How is it affecting? You know, like Frontex, the EU agency, was using Israeli drones to push out migrants. So how can you organize, I think, with migrants, you know, migrants' rights defenders to push out these EU agency from contracting these very harmful technologies? So I think that's what the US has really managed to do, is to create these solidarities among these different groups, this creating common progressive causes that I think are important to fight for, including Palestine. That would be one of the big lessons that I would say is happening. And I think in the US, I think too, I think the evolution of the Jewish community and the Jewish diaspora in the US has been very important in terms of changing the narrative, because they basically, once they started saying what Palestinians, and we've been saying for years, as you know, when the dominant group starts saying something, and then obviously it's listened to in any struggle. And I think that's also an important, you know, thing is how do you also kind of have dialogues, or I don't know, discuss with your own Jewish communities of, you know, actually the safety of the Jewish communities or the Jewish people is contradictory with what Israel is doing at the moment, like maintaining apartheid and a violent occupation is not bringing more safety in the long term or peace. That's another lesson. And I think the third one is clearly about the discourse and narrative. So really kind of reconciling, I think, trying to reconcile the political discourse with the reality that eventually we're in the whole territory. Israel has sovereignty and it's controlling and it's maintaining this regime of domination with one of a people over another, and that's apartheid. And that's clearly, you know, this there is a one oppressor and one oppressed. And I think kind of reconciling, I think, the political discourse with the reality is important, and to try and break away from, I think, this illusion that there is on the one hand Palestinian or Palestine, on the other hand Israel, and that this is just a dispute, and that eventually if they come to a dialogue then things will be better. I think no, I think the power dynamics are such that you need accountability. And I think that discourse in the media, I think interesting young people around that is how it has, you know, worked, I think, to make people understand better what's really happening. And that's also, I think, changing slowly in Europe. The Amnesty report helps, you know, the Human Rights Watch report help, but it's work in progress.
Mm-hmm. Actually, the next question could be additional to this, because somebody's asking about the system of apartheid in South Africa, and would it be an idea to adopt the strategy of a full-fledged boycott of Israel?
Yes, I mean, boycott is definitely one tactic that needs to be adopted. Whoever can adopt full boycott of Israel should. I think the point of the coalitions and the campaigns we just presented is how are you moving the goalposts? We know that financial institutions, that the governments, that the EU are not going to boycott Israel tomorrow. Unfortunately, I wish, but that's not going to happen. So the question is, how do we use existing international law? How do we use existing resolutions? How do we use existing very clear illegality in the international order and the obligation of states as written already in international law and as written in their own policies? And how do we call them to their own word? Now, the full boycott of Israel is the step after, but it needs political will. We need to normalize, I think, the discourse around sanctions, around the need to isolate Israel, around the need to ban arms trade with Israel. All of these are a form of boycott. But I think there's different tactics to be adopted to move the goalpost, because today, as it stands, you have regimes like Arab regimes, Europeans, US, that are applauding normalization with Israel, that are completely disregarding whatever is happening on the ground as a reality, and are strengthening their ties with Israel, that are strengthening cooperation agreements, business agreements, and that have completely erased and sidelined Palestinians. And so I think that's what's happening on the political scene. We have to be realistic at the moment we're in. And I think, like expecting that, if we just all go to boycott the government, the Europeans will do it tomorrow is obviously not happening. So I think it's different steps and different tactics to go towards isolation.
Okay, thank you. I have a question on, we have, I think it's a minister, I don't know, who is, trying to, or is prohibiting advertisements on shirts of sports people of gambling companies. And now we see Israel is sponsoring a cycling group. Would there be something we could do to react to that? Because Israel is violating international law.
I think we could technically. I don't think it's going to happen soon. I think it's definitely. I think there, Ines mentioned it already. Also, sort of the difference between the actions we're taking towards Russia versus the actions we're taking towards Israel, where obviously if Russia would be sponsoring a cycling team, it would immediately be shut down. So obviously there's a clear precedent and a possibility to shut that sort of thing down. The question is just, do we want to, and does our government want to? I think at this point that won't happen, but it's I think I saw the question. It's can we do something about that? Yeah, I think we could, hypothetically.
Yeah, it's something indeed we could think of, but it's true that you can say something about the professional sports world in general, of course, about abusing its abuse from on many levels, and so once you start somewhere, I don't know if we will end somewhere.
If we're holding a football world championship in Qatar.
Yes, for example,
Yeah, the sports world has definitely a lot of problems. I think it's just that if it's a local or more of a national competition or something, you can expect, for example, a Belgian federation to be a bit better. So if you want to hold your own federations accountable, I think that's easier. I mean, the Palestinians have tried to have Israel kicked out of FIFA for a long time. And, in 2 weeks, they kicked out Russia. So it's obviously political. It's very, very political. And it's a matter of choice, unfortunately. Now, in any case, when you see, part of injustice or Israel sponsoring an event, it's a matter of organizing and trying to understand who has the power to take decisions on this. In Sydney, like in Australia, there was this Sydney festival that is a big cultural festival that Israel is sponsoring. And, a few Australians, Palestinians, they organized and they managed to have many artists withdrawing. So if you want, for example, it depends what interests you. So, we're very involved to get 1 million signatures to get EU to ban trade with settlements. But at your own level in your city, if you see that, your own sports federation or the Belgian Sports Federation is accepting sponsoring from Israel, you can see who it's like any campaign, like who takes the decision, who can be held accountable, how can you call them out, how can you name and shame, who can you bring on board from the sports people to make a post about this and maybe raise the media attention. I mean, it's like any campaign. I think there is ways to hold and to name and shame when Israel is normalized, especially with its what we call soft power, cultural or sports, etc. But it requires organizing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There is a question about potatoes, if they are boycotted, import of potatoes.
I think there are some. I've heard of some actions against Israeli potatoes, but just I think Israel exports a lot of potatoes, a lot of sustainable potatoes. I don't have any specific information more than that, but I think yes, it's a part of campaigns.
I think the ABP had done a campaign on this, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
The French, the Francophone Belgium Palestine Association.
Okay. Yes, that might.
But again, let's ban all potatoes to coming to Belgium. That would be best. And if you know the potatoes, no, because it's Israeli potatoes, right? It's not Belgian. If you know importers, there's also ways to, if you can identify importers already, that would be a step, right? If we can call out the importers already.
Yeah. Okay. At the moment, I don't see any more questions. I give a last opportunity. If somebody wants to ask a question. Jozef, you are helping Benoit, maybe, or yeah. So then I'm typing the action of this coming weekend. So the circles of silence we are organizing for the Nakba commemoration. You can find it on this link. So there are everywhere in Flanders, from the east to the west. You can join an action, but please check where you can find them and at what day and what hour, because it's on different days and different hours. And the idea behind this circle of silence is that we stand during 1 hour in silence as symbolic gesture to the Palestinian voice that is also silent. Of course, we will make a press release, and we hope. In the previous years, there was sometimes often local press, not always national press, but we will try to get press attention as well. And of course, we will also make a statement to the relevant ministers, because this action is important, and we are how to say it, hooking our wagon, I don't know if that's an expression in English, to the train that's already being pulled forward by the coalition, Don't Buy into Occupation. And so I think our government already knows about this campaign, but it cannot hurt that we add our advocacy to it. So I hope to see people at our circles of silence this weekend, and there will be more actions also by 11. So we will make promotion or be part of it. So thank you, Jozef and Ines, for your presence and for your clear introduction and very well argumented answers to all the questions that were asked. I want to thank also the people who attended, because they were very active with a lot of questions. And so I hope we will continue, and that we will, with the same energy as we sense the last months, even though we have another war going on. We are trying to divide our energy to different kinds of injustice. So thank you, and thank all the attendees, and then I hope to see you soon somewhere in Belgium.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Dag.
Goodbye.
Have a nice evening.
Bye.
Bye.